What would you have done in Ethan's shoes? Could you forgive, or would revenge consume you? Let us know in the comments. And while you're at it, tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing this community grow worldwide. If this story gripped you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss tomorrow's powerful story, one that might just change the way you see the world. Your next favorite story is just one click away. His wife left a heartbreaking letter, and it led to a shocking confrontation. The air was crisp that evening, a chilly 42 degrees Fahrenheit, as Ethan Carter stepped out of his car, rolling his shoulders to shake off the exhaustion from his 4-day business trip. He had been looking forward to coming home, to seeing Lily, his wife of 6 years, waiting for him at the door with that warm smile. But as he reached the front steps of their 2,500 square foot suburban home in Chicago, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Something was wrong. The house was dark. Usually, Lily would leave the porch light on for him. But tonight, nothing. No sign of life. Frowning, Ethan pulled out his keys and stepped inside. The silence was deafening. No soft music playing from the kitchen, no scent of her favorite lavender candles. He called her name once, twice. No answer. His first thought was that she might be out late with friends, but that wasn't like her. She always let him know where she was. He reached for his phone and dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. A wave of unease tightened his stomach. And then, the doorbell rang. Ethan hurried to the door, hoping it was her, maybe having forgotten her key. But as he opened it, his heart dropped. Standing on the porch were 2 uniformed police officers, their expressions grim. "Mr. Carter," one of them asked, voice calm but firm. "Yes," Ethan answered, his throat suddenly dry. "Your wife is Lily Carter, correct?" Ethan's chest tightened. "Yes." "What's going on?" The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second before delivering the words that shattered his world. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have bad news." The rest of their words blurred into an incomprehensible hum. He barely processed the details, something about a river, a body being found, an autopsy pending. The world around him slowed, as if reality had been ripped from beneath his feet. Lily was gone. Just like that. Numbness spread through his body as the officers explained what little they knew. Her car had been found near Millennium Park, far from their usual neighborhood. A fisherman had spotted a body in the river that morning. The coroner suspected drowning, but something about it didn't make sense. Ethan barely felt the officers' hands on his shoulder, offering their condolences. He was still standing, but his mind was free falling into an abyss. When they finally left, he stood in the dimly lit hallway, gripping the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His gaze fell on the wedding photo hanging on the wall, Lily, laughing in her white dress, looking at him like he was her whole world. Now, she was gone. And he had no idea why. But he was about to find out. And the truth would break him all over again. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the crumpled letter in his shaking hands. Lily's words were smudged with water stains, her own tears, now mixed with his. "My love, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I can't live with what I've done, with what Greg has done to me." Ethan's grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. Greg Sullivan. The name burned in his mind like a brand. He had trusted that man. Let Lily work for him. And now, she was dead because of him. The clock on the nightstand read 2:14 a.m., but sleep was impossible. His mind raced with one thought: Greg had to pay. For hours, he sat in the dark, replaying everything Lily had written. How Greg had trapped her in his office, forced himself on her, and then threatened to release a doctored video that would ruin her reputation if she didn't comply. How she had been trapped in his grasp for weeks, unable to tell anyone. How the shame consumed her until she saw no other way out. Ethan's chest ached as he imagined the fear in her eyes, the hopelessness in her heart. He could almost hear her crying in the dark, alone. And he hadn't been there to save her. That thought alone made his blood boil. He wasn't thinking about consequences. He wasn't thinking about logic. He was thinking about revenge. Without another second of hesitation, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out the door. The drive to Sullivan Insurance Agency was a blur. The streets of downtown Chicago were nearly empty at this hour, streetlights casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Ethan's hands clenched the steering wheel so hard his fingers ached. By the time he reached the office building, he was running on pure adrenaline. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for one car, a black Mercedes-Benz with vanity plates that read Sully 1. Greg was still here. Perfect. Ethan didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open so hard the handle cracked the wall behind it. Greg looked up from his desk, startled. His expensive Rolex glinted under the office lights as he stood up, an artificial smile creeping onto his face. "Ethan," he said smoothly, adjusting his tie. The punch landed before he could finish. Greg staggered back, hitting the desk with a grunt. The shock in his eyes was quickly replaced with fear as Ethan grabbed him by the collar and threw him across the desk. "You killed her," Ethan growled, his voice shaking with fury. "You blackmailed my wife. And now, I'm going to make you feel every ounce of pain she did." Greg stammered, begged, pleaded. But Ethan didn't hear him. Not over the sound of his fists connecting with Greg's face. Not over the roar of his own fury. Not over the screams that filled the office. By the time the red and blue lights flashed through the office window, Greg wasn't smiling anymore. And Ethan? He was just getting started. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Ethan's wrists as the officers dragged him out of the office. His knuckles were raw, his breathing ragged. He could still hear Greg's groans behind him, still see the fear in his eyes. But none of it mattered. Lily was still gone. The flashing red and blue lights painted the parking lot in streaks of chaos as the officers shoved him into the back seat of the squad car. One of them muttered something about aggravated assault, but Ethan barely heard it. His ears were still ringing with rage. Greg deserved worse. Much worse. The next few hours blurred into a nightmare, fingerprints, mugshots, a cold holding cell. He didn't fight it. He didn't care. The only thing that mattered was Lily's letter. He had given it to the officers, told them it was proof of what Greg had done. They had taken it. Logged it as evidence. But Ethan had no idea just how quickly evidence could disappear. 3 months behind bars had done nothing to dull Ethan's rage. If anything, it had sharpened it. He spent every night in that cold, gray cell, replaying the trial, replaying Greg's smug smirk, replaying the moment he lost everything. By the time he was released, one thing was clear: Greg Sullivan had gotten away with it. Or at least, he thought he had. Ethan stepped out into the bitter Chicago air, inhaling deeply. His fists clenched at his sides. He had no job, no home, no Lily. But he still had vengeance. For a year, Ethan kept a low profile. He moved to a small apartment, took whatever work he could find, and watched. Greg's life had taken a hit after the trial. The scandal had damaged his reputation, but not enough. He was still running his business. Still walking free. But Ethan wasn't the only one keeping tabs on him. One night, as Ethan sat in a diner nursing a cup of coffee, he overheard a conversation at the next table. "Sullivan? That bastard's playing the same game in his new office. But this time, he messed with the wrong guy's wife." Ethan's grip tightened around his mug. He turned slightly, his pulse quickening. "Who's the guy?" someone asked. A chuckle. "Marcus Bell." "You don't screw with Marcus Bell." Ethan knew that name. A local enforcer. Dangerous. And if Greg had wronged his family, Ethan had just found his wild card. A week later, Ethan was walking home when he saw Greg across the street. Greg's face went pale the moment their eyes met. "Fielding," Greg muttered, stepping back. "Stay the hell away from me." Ethan smirked. "Why? Scared?" Greg's fists clenched, but he wasn't a fighter. He was a coward. Always had been. You're going to pay for what you did to Lily, Ethan growled, stepping forward. One way or another. Greg snapped. He threw a punch, sloppy, untrained. Ethan barely had to dodge. He let Greg's fist graze his chin, exaggerating the impact. Just enough to make it look good. Just enough for witnesses to see who threw the first punch. Greg came at him again, but this time, Ethan didn't dodge. He struck back. A quick, calculated punch to the ribs, then a crushing blow to the throat. Greg collapsed, gasping. People were shouting. Sirens blared in the distance. Ethan took a step back, his hands raised. This was it. The moment he had waited for. But as Greg clutched his throat, coughing and choking, a new sound cut through the noise, a gunshot. Greg froze, his eyes widening in shock before he crumpled to the ground. Ethan spun around, heart pounding. In the shadows stood Marcus Bell, lowering his gun. Ethan stared. Marcus met his gaze. You don't need to thank me, Marcus muttered before vanishing into the night. Greg Sullivan was dead. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt free. The courtroom was packed on the day of his trial. The media had gotten wind of the case, a grieving husband, a respected businessman, and a brutal assault that left Greg Sullivan with 2 broken ribs, a fractured nose, and 6 stitches across his brow. Ethan sat at the defense table, his lawyer whispering legal jargon in his ear, but none of it sank in. His eyes stayed locked on Greg, who sat across the room, looking pitiful with a bandage on his forehead. Liar. Coward. Greg wouldn't even look at him. Then, the moment came. Ethan's lawyer stood, ready to present Lily's letter, the truth. The real reason Ethan had gone after Greg. But when the judge asked for the evidence, the prosecutor shook his head. We have no such document, Your Honor. Ethan froze. His lawyer turned to him, confusion written across his face. Ethan, where's the letter? Ethan's heart pounded. I gave it to the cops, he hissed. The prosecutor cleared his throat. We checked all evidence logs. No such letter exists. A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. No. No, this couldn't be happening. He shot a look at Greg, and for the first time that day, Greg met his eyes. And smiled. Something inside Ethan snapped. He lunged forward, but the bailiff held him back. He shouted, cursed, told them to search again, check the logs, check the damn security cameras. But it was no use. The only proof he had of Greg's crimes was gone. And now, the trial was nothing more than a brutal assault case. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict? Guilty. The sentence? 3 months in Cook County Jail. As the judge banged the gavel, sealing Ethan's fate, Greg leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie like he had already won. But Ethan knew something Greg didn't. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, staring at Greg Sullivan's lifeless body. The once powerful man lay crumpled on the pavement, his eyes frozen in shock, blood pooling beneath him. It was over. Greg was dead. But the weight in Ethan's chest didn't lift. The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the surrounding buildings. People were shouting, some running, some frozen in place. But Ethan barely noticed. His eyes drifted to the dark alley where Marcus Bell had disappeared moments earlier. The man had done what Ethan had dreamed of doing, pulling the trigger, ending Greg's miserable existence. But why didn't it feel like victory? The interrogation room at Chicago PD was cold and sterile. Ethan sat across from Detective Miller, arms crossed, face blank. You were there when Sullivan got shot, Miller said, flipping through a file. Want to explain that? Ethan met his gaze. I didn't pull the trigger. Miller studied him. We know. But you had motive. Plenty of it. Ethan exhaled. He could see it in the detective's eyes. Miller wanted this case wrapped up. But without evidence, without a witness placing the gun in Ethan's hand, they had nothing. Greg Sullivan was a scumbag, Miller finally said, closing the file. Nobody's shedding tears over him. A pause. You're free to go. Ethan walked out of the police station a free man, but freedom felt empty. For years, his hatred for Greg had defined him. Every breath, every thought, every action had been fueled by the need for revenge. And now, there was nothing left. He wandered the streets, aimless. The city moved around him, people rushing to work, cabs honking, street vendors calling out orders. Life went on. But Ethan felt stuck in the past. That's when he saw the sign, "Therapist Walk-ins Welcome." He almost kept walking. Almost ignored it. But something inside him, maybe Lily's voice, maybe exhaustion, made him step through the door. Dr. Callahan was a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a patient smile. He didn't push. Didn't judge. He just listened. And for the first time in years, Ethan talked. About Lily. About Greg. About the rage that had nearly consumed him. And finally, about the guilt. If I had been there. If I had seen the signs. Maybe Lily would still be alive. Dr. Callahan leaned forward. You blame yourself because blaming her is unbearable. Ethan's throat tightened. But Lily was a victim, Ethan, Callahan continued. And so were you. The only way you move forward is if you stop punishing yourself for surviving. Years passed. Ethan built a new life, found love again, even became a father. But some nights, when the world was quiet, he still saw Lily's smile in his dreams. And deep down, he knew a part of him would always belong to her. Ethan's journey was filled with pain, loss, and a thirst for revenge, but in the end, he had to make the hardest choice of all, letting go. If you were in his shoes, would you have done the same? Could you walk away from hatred and choose forgiveness? Or would you have taken justice into your own hands? Let's talk about it. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Did Ethan make the right choice? What would you have done differently? And most importantly, do you believe true healing comes from revenge or forgiveness? Also, let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. If this story made you think, hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales of resilience, justice, and second chances. A brand new story drops tomorrow, and trust us, you won't want to miss it. Turn on notifications so you're the first to see what happens next. Your voice matters, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say.